Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Today we'll discuss a very important aspect of scriptural history, and this actually relates to how the Quran at times corrects the previous scriptures, as has been explained by the celebrated Indian scholar Imam Hameed Uddin Farahi. We have often discussed some of his views, and today I'll bring forth before you how he has given certain examples regarding the corrections which the Quran has made in certain aspects of biblical history. However, before I venture forth in explaining how Ustaaz Hameed Farahi has explained this topic, it would be in order to describe the fact that as far as the previous scriptures are concerned, the Quran has repeatedly said that they have the same religion, exactly the same religion which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They were revealed the same religion, and as far as the practices are concerned, as far as the rituals are concerned, as far as the articles of faith are concerned, there is absolutely no difference between the previous divine religions. And in their own times, they were actually Islam, nothing but Islam. And over a period of time, because of the fact that the original language of these scriptures could not be preserved, it happened that certain translations made their way into the text. At times they were erroneously translated, at times explanations became part of the text, at times it was a misunderstanding of the text themselves. So we can see that the Bible that we have today, which is of course the Old Testament and the New Testament combined, it has a lot of things which are in line with the Quran, and it presents the same religion which the Quran actually presents. But then there are certain historical discrepancies which have crept into the text of the Bible. It is here primarily that the Quran has corrected them so that there is absolutely no confusion regarding the truth. So Ustaz Hameed Farahi, while explaining the last verse of Surah Shams, has actually brought forth this subject in a secondary way, but then he has elaborated upon it as well, and has said that the Quranic verse, the last Quranic verse of Surah Shams is Wala yakhafu uqbaha, and right before that the incident of the nation of Samud has been mentioned, in which it has been explained that how they were decimated and wiped out from the face of the earth. And then occurs this small verse, Wala yakhafu uqbaha, and God had no fear of its consequences. Of course, fear here again means that he had no fear that any mistake had been made by wiping them out, because according to the law of God, polytheist nations who intentionally deny the prophets of God, they are decimated, they are totally wiped off. And of course, he was also not afraid, that God had no fear of the consequences, that anyone would challenge his verdict. On the other hand, the Bible actually tells us that there was a certain time when this earth was filled with sin and evil, that God actually regretted making people. And in this way, Ustaz Hameed Farahi has said that the Quran has actually upgraded the statement of the Bible by telling us that it was not that the Almighty was in any way regretful or even had any fear of the consequences of destroying people if they had intentionally denied a messenger of God. So we know that in the Old Testament, let me quote you the exact verses. The verse actually is the book of Genesis. It's chapter number 6, verses 5 and 6. It says, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." So basically, Ustaz Hameed Farahi tells us that here the Quran has actually corrected the Bible and told us that the Almighty had absolutely no regrets of creating mankind. He had created mankind on the basis of a very well thought of scheme, and that scheme was that he would send messengers of God, his own messengers, to people, and then if they deliberately, intentionally deny them, he will punish them in this world, so that this punishment could be made a proof of the greater punishment that's going to take place in the hereafter. So by stating these facts, or this particular fact, the Almighty has actually corrected the Bible as well, or the Quran has corrected the Bible as well, by saying that this was a very definitive verdict of the Almighty, and there was absolutely no question of any regret. He had no fear of the consequences, either of any error in the judgment or in the verdict that he had passed, or that it might be challenged by anyone in this regard. Now, viewers, Ustaaz Hameed Farahi, while explaining this last verse of Surah Shams, has also given us another example, and he has said that basically we need to understand that the status of the Quran is that of Muhaymin. And in Surah Ma'idah, verse 48, where this word occurs, it actually tells us that it is a guardian over the previous scriptures. This means that it protects the previous scriptures, it sets them right in case of any discrepancy. And this status of Muhaymin of the Quran entails that we have to rely on the Quran whenever there is a discrepancy, because as we have been discussing all over and all along, that the Quran is the scripture of God, which is the final testament. It has been preserved in its original language. There has been no change in that language, contrary to the previous scriptures, whose original language does not exist today. The original languages of all the previous scriptures is not extant, and we basically rely on translations in understanding them. And as a result, when the Almighty revealed the final word, which is the Quran, His purpose was to actually give us an internal guidance and have it protected. And that guidance would act as a guardian and as a balance and as a final verdict over all previous scriptures as well. So the other example which Ustaaz Farahi has given and also affirmed, that there are so many things which the Quran actually affirms of the Bible, but there are certain things which it also corrects. So this famous verse in the Quran, it tells us that وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَّامٍ. This creation of the heavens and the earth in 6 days, this has been mentioned in the Quran at a number of places. But in Surah Qaf, the 50th surah, where this expression actually occurs, it is extended by another small phrase, and that is وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِن لَغُوبٍ, which means that no weariness, no tiredness came upon us. So the Almighty is saying that we created the heavens and the earth and whatever is between them in 6 days. And of course, this is something which the Bible also says. It also says that the Almighty created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. It is here that the Bible and the Quran concur. But the addition of the phrase وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِن لُغُوبٍ actually is a comment of the Quran on the Bible, which tells us that the Almighty rested on the 7th day when He had created the heavens and the earth. And we know that in the book of Genesis, this is chapter number 2 and verse 2, it says, by the 7th day God had finished the work He had been doing, so on the 7th day He rested from all His work. So here the Bible tells us that it was the 7th day when God apparently rested. He did not work on that day. He had finished His work. And the Quran, on the contrary, tells us that the Almighty, the power of the Almighty, the attributes of the Almighty are such that He did not require any rest. It was something which people have to know, that the power and the strength of the Almighty is such that He is always doing something or the other. As we know from Surah Rahman, the words are Kulla yawman huwa fi shan. He's up to something at every instant He's doing something. And in the creation of the heavens and the earth also, there was no tiredness or weariness that came upon Him. And this وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِن لُغُوبٍ, actually, if you pick up Surah Qaf and read through this verse, the question might arise is that why is it that the Quran is actually telling us that that the Almighty never got tired? So the answer would be that it will become much more meaningful if we know that one of the previous scriptures has actually alluded to the fact that God got tired and He rested on the 7th day. In the absence of this previous background, one will really question that why is it that the Quran is informing us that the Almighty did not get tired after creating the heavens and the earth. So here again is an instance in which the Quran has actually corrected biblical historical a point of view, a particular area of biblical history. Another example, viewers, if we can go on and go along with the views of Imam Ustaaz Hameed Farahi, the way he has explained them, and actually I have also explained this at another talk as well, and that is that in the Old Testament we know that the son which Abraham presented for sacrifice was Isaac. It is stated that Isaac is the son who was presented by Abraham for sacrifice. However, the Quran corrects this, and it tells us that it was not, of course, Isaac, it was Ishmael. And the way the Quran has corrected it, of course, has a very subtle ring to it, and I have explained it elsewhere in Surah Safat, the way after the biblical incident, after the Quranic incident of sacrifice is mentioned, it is said that the Almighty gave Abraham the glad tidings of another son, which is Isaac, which automatically tells us that the son which was sacrificed by Abraham was actually, or presented for sacrifice, was Ishmael, although his name has not been taken by the Quran. And also, viewers, we know that that Ustaaz Uddin Farahi from the Old Testament itself has explained to us that how still today, where the words of Isaac have been placed in the Old Testament, and to be precise, this is chapter number 2 and in the book of Genesis again, and it tells us that then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." So we have, Ustaaz Uddin Farahi has actually said that please do consider the words only son, which means that he would be the son, the elder son, when there's no other sibling. That's the only conclusion that can be drawn. Of course, if a son has some other sibling, it cannot be said of him that he is the only son. So, after noting this fact, Ustaaz Uddin Farahi again directs our attention to some of the other passages of the Bible, book of Genesis to be precise. He tells us that the book of Genesis, chapter 16, verse 16 tells us that when Ishmael was born, Abraham was 86 years old. And then in chapter 21 of book of Genesis and verse 5, it is said that Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So if we just add up all these verses, we can clearly see that when Isaac was born, Ishmael had already been born, and therefore the words only son cannot be spoken of Isaac, because Ishmael was born before Isaac, and these are the words of the Old Testament itself. It's not that the Quran is presenting them. So Ustaaz Uddin Farahi has said that this correction made by the Quran, that it was not Isaac who was sacrificed, it was Ishmael, is not only corroborated merely by the fact that the Quran has asserted so, but also from the Bible itself, where even today, the way these verses have been presented, it clearly tells us that it was Ishmael and not Isaac, because the word only son for Isaac are not fit at all, because on another instance we have told that the firstborn of Abraham was Ishmael, and hence at the time of the sacrifice of Ishmael, it was only about him that it can be said that he was the only son. Viewers, we can give many more examples as well in which the Quran has corrected the Bible or some of the historical elements of the Bible. But before I sign off, let me also give you another example, and this example is something which occurs in the very 3rd chapter, the very beginning of the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, in which we know that the incident which took place between Adam and Eve, it is said that they were, it is of course we know from the Quran as well and from the Old Testament, that the Almighty had asked them not to eat the fruit of a certain tree. And the story, the way it has been presented in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, it tells us that it was basically Eve who enticed Adam to eat this fruit, and as a result Adam got enticed and both of them ate this fruit, and the Almighty was very annoyed. Of course, Eve herself had been enticed by the serpent, and at this the Almighty not only rebuked the serpent and said that you will always crawl along the ground, and Adam would smash your head, and there would be enmity between you and women folk. It also said that women will suffer from labor pains. The progeny of Eve will suffer from labor pains when they bear their children because of this sin which was committed by Eve, that she had enticed Adam. On the contrary, we know from the Quran that the Quran says that it was not Eve who enticed Adam. It was not this case. It was the fact that both of them got enticed at the same time. this is not the fault of Eve as is presented in the Old Testament, and we have discussed this elsewhere as well. So we need to understand that as far as the corrections of the Quran are made, they are primarily done in a lot of historical incidents and in a lot of historical happenings, because it is here that the tempering has been made, because of the fact that the narrators of the Old and the New Testament, they have of course mixed up some of the translations, as well as some of their own understanding has actually become part of the text as well. As far as the New Testament is concerned, we know that, for example, the incident of crucifixion, which is present in or at least referred to, is totally negated by the Quran. It says, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. The Quran says that Jesus was not crucified and he was not killed. He did not kill him. So this again is a correction which the Quran has made, and as we go along, you can see how at times these corrections are made by the Quran. And again, the point to emphasize here is that, as Ustaaz Hameed Farahi has pointed out, that the status of the Quran is that of Muhaymin. And as I said earlier on, that the word Muhaymin actually means that whenever there is going to be a discrepancy between the Quran and the previous testaments, then the verdict of the Quran has got to prevail, because of the fact that it has been preserved in its original language and it now stands as a guardian over the previous scriptures. And having said that, at the same time, we must also understand that besides these corrections, the Quran has also lauded the Old and the New Testaments, and it has said, Fihe Hudan wa Nur. The words are that it has guidance and light. Regarding the Torah, which was given to Moses, the words are, it was Furqan basically. It had the same status as the Quran. It was a distinguisher between good and evil. And similarly, we know that people who had followed the Bible in their own times were led to believe in the last prophet, because they found that it is their own book which is actually corroborating his arrival. So the Quran refers to the Bible at many places. It tells believers to go and read the Bible and see how the Bible itself has predicted the arrival of the final prophet, and how there are so many things which are similar between the Bible and the Quran. So in a nutshell, we need to understand that in spite of the fact that the Quran is the guardian, is Muhaymin, and does correct a lot of historical references which have been corrupted in the Old and the New Testaments, but at the same time, it by and large corroborates the Injil and the Torah, which was present in the times of the Prophet Muhammad, which means that they still contain religion in its right form to a very large extent. And hence, as people who read the Quran, we have to read the Old and the New Testaments as well. And remember, when we say that we will not differentiate between the prophets and we shall believe in all the books of God, it of course means that all of the books of God, they have to be read. Otherwise, if you believe in a book and don't read it, there's absolutely no logic in this. Logic entails that if you believe in a certain book, which we have to, because we know that the Quran says that you have to believe in وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ وَمَا أُنزِلَ مِن قَبْلِكَ, as the Quran at the very beginning states, that we have to believe in the Quran and in the previous scriptures. And no belief is complete unless we understand what we are believing in. So reading the previous scriptures, trying to understand them, and at the same time, whenever there's a discrepancy, holding the Quran as the Muhaymin, as the torchlight in which we can see if there is any darkness in the previous scriptures, it will be lit up by the Quran. So this was what I wanted to bring before you. I would advise all of you to please pick up Ustaaz Hameed Farahi's tafsir, Surah Shams. He has explained this, and if you read his works, you will find that there are many places in which he has proposed and told us how the Quran is corrected, the Old Testament. And this is something which will open up our minds and at the same time create a lot of respect, a lot of regard for the previous scriptures. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين والمسلمات.